Hey there! Today we're going to do something completely different. I'm going to talk about samurai swords. I collect samurai swords. I have not bought new ones for quite a while because I kind of found out that the pen is mightier than the sword. But I did collect them for quite a while, and I know that some of you are interested. I think there are at least 2 videos where a sword has shown up. People were very enthusiastic about that, and I know that some of you have almost begged me to do a review of some swords. Now, I'm not going to do a review of every sword I own, because I want to keep my channel pen-oriented, but I do think it's nice to just talk about swords for a while. So these are my swords. You should realize that these are made in China. They are not folded steel, but they are functional. So you can actually chop up stuff with this, and that's actually what I do. So in the summer I go out and I take a watermelon and it dies, and that's pretty much all there's to it. So as you can see, there are different types of swords, and I just want to talk you through every type. Every type of sword, tell you what its merits are, what it was used for. And then down on my bed here, you can't see that now, but I've got some other weapons, 2 pole arms and a very big sword. I'll come back to those in a second. Okay, so a bit of samurai history. It's not the History Channel, but samurai were a warrior class in feudal Japan. And they were very important. They ruled the nation. They were led by a guy called the shogun, and the shogun was actually more important than the emperor. So the emperor was like his straw puppet. Samurai were a warrior class. A samurai boy would receive sword training when he was 4 years old. That's the age when it usually starts, with wooden swords, then with blunt metal swords, shinken. Wooden sword is called boken or bokuto. Then shinken, but unsharpened, so they had a metal sword but it was not sharpened. Then it would get a real sword. Now usually they would start off with something like this, like a smaller sword. But imagine that. Imagine being 4 years old and being given a sword. And when you were about 16 years old, your father would often take you to jail, and there would be some prisoners, and he would say, here's a sword, just behead these people. Now, these are live people. Imagine what that is like when you're 16 years old. The samurai were legendary warriors. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole argument of which is the greatest warrior that I've lived. Is it Spartans, is it Romans, is it samurai? It doesn't really matter. Samurai were just highly trained soldiers. And although everyone associates them with the sword was not their primary weapon. Samurai were mounted archers. They used bow and arrow on horseback. When they ran out of arrows, or when the bowstring broke, they had a spare bowstring. You can see that, and if you see pictures of a samurai from the era, you usually see there's a type of donut on his belt, but that's actually a spare bowstring. But of course, changing that in the battlefield when arrows are whizzing around you is not very practical. So then they would switch to a pole arm. And a pole arm could be something like this. This is called a yari. A yari is a spear. And a spear is superior to the sword, because a spear is long, and with a spear you can do things like that. So you can actually stab, and that's what these were made for. So you can make stabbing motions, and it's very, very sharp on both edges, which means that you could probably penetrate someone's armor with it, but you can also cut with it. So you can actually have to be very careful. You don't want to hit the ceiling, but you can make cutting motions. Something like that. And you can hear that too. At the end of the spear was something like this. This is a brass, this is a brass knob. I'm going to cover that up now. The brass knob was to bash someone's skull in. So, it's just brass, but that's pretty hard. And you can actually use it to kick, to hit people with it and kick the face in. They could also use another type of pole arm. This I like a lot. It's called naginata. And that is a serious weapon. There was a type of monk, Buddhist monk, called sohei. And the sohei were a type of warrior monk. And they used this. This is basically a short sword on a stick. Some of them were a lot longer. This one is I'd say mediocre length. It's not that long. Interestingly enough, there's some cool stuff about this. First of all, the nakago, that's the tang of a blade, that's the metal part that goes into the handle, extends up to about this point. You see that this is a bamboo pin that actually holds the blade in place. You see it is very long, and that actually makes sure that when you hit someone with it, this thing won't snap. You know, it actually is in there to be secured and be tight. This was also the weapon of samurai women. When they defended their homes, if your husband was a samurai, you were a samurai. And they had to do some type of fighting, and they often used this, a naginata jutsu, so the naginata techniques, the sports, the martial art, is still practiced by a lot of women, even in modern day Japan. But you also see that this thing has a tsuba, that's this round thing. It's like a cross guard, and that makes sure your hand doesn't actually slide on the blade, but it can also, you can catch an opponent's sword on that, for example. Okay, cover that up again. This one, too, has an interesting thing right there. Again, that's just to crack someone's skull. You can hit with that. And if you see an experienced naginata wielder, it's fantastic. These things just twirl around. You can use them with both sides. You can hit with one end. You can slash with the other. You can stab with them. It's a very, very dynamic weapon, and I absolutely love it. Okay, when it comes to the real swords, a samurai always wore two swords. A short sword called wakizashi, also known as shoto, short sword, and a daito, big sword, large sword, also known as katana. And this is what most people think of when they think of a samurai sword. So, a katana, also known as daito, and the shoto always went together. Samurai were obliged to wear the two swords at all times when going outside. It was the badge of their status as being samurai. No one else was allowed to carry two swords. When you speak of a daisho, so daito and shoto together, that's the combination of a katana and a wakizashi. So there's two swords. Now imagine what would happen. They would put this in their belt. I'm not wearing a kimono, I don't have the broad belt. Goes something like this. And then you have a big sword, which goes over that. Something like this. So this would go close to the belly, this would go up. You can draw the two of them. Imagine that. You walk around with this. Do you think anyone's going to argue with you? I don't think so. When they are a daisho, so when you wear the two together, they should have matching fittings. What I mean by that is that when you look at the tsuba, that cross guard, this is the sun, okay? And this is the same thing. So these would go together. Whereas this tsuba is completely different. So these would not match. That would not officially be a daisho. The sword consists of a number of parts, and as with a lot of Japanese things, every part has a name. You have the saya, the scabbard, which is lacquered wood. You have the sageo, which is this cord. The cord is used, I'm not going to use that one, let me just use this one. The cord is used to make sure the scabbard stays in place. Some scabbards had a little hook. Samurai wore an obi, right? Think of the traditional Japanese kimono, this broad sash. Well, it's a lot easier to keep these things in place. And you can just take this and sort of tie it in there, so you make sure you don't actually, drop it. It doesn't slide out. Okay, so we're talking about parts. Saya, sageo, the cord, usually made of silk or cotton. Tsuka, the grip. Tsuba, the cross guard. Kashira, the end cap. It's like a blind cap on a fountain pen, at the very end. Itomaki, that's this wrapping. Very nicely done. There's usually a bit of ornament in there. And right now, I forgot the name. But it's either gold or brass or whatever. Something in there which gives a good grip. And it just looks cool. The blade, you shouldn't talk while you hold the sword. Spit may cause it to rust, but this is actually a zinc alloy that doesn't rust. You have the blade, obviously, you have the kisaki, the actual tip. I already talked about the nakago, the tang that's in there. Here's a bamboo pin that keeps the blade in place. Here's the habaki, which is usually brass. Seppa spacer to make sure that that's actually the sort of sandwich, the cross guard. And that's all there's to it. Now, what you have to realize is that these swords are pretty much razors. They're as sharp as a razor blade, except they're quite a bit bigger. And they are weapons. So whatever you do with a sword, I mean, when you appreciate it, you hold it arm's length, you check it out. It has a beautiful curvature. Some swords have more curvature than others. This is a wakizashi, so a shorter one with not an extreme bit of curvature, but it is a weapon. So you have to be careful when you're using it. So you can try to do something like this. Now it's not a very good idea because it's in fact very sharp, except this one is a practice sword, so that will not cut at all. But even so, you should never do that. It's very, very dangerous. I mean, be careful. And just to be sure, I would never, ever, ever do that with a sharp sword. Okay, so there we have that. So we have the wakizashi. That's the one I just showed you, the small sword. Why would you use that? Well, a short sword has a number of interesting functions. First of all, it's short and it's light. So you can take that in your left hand, your non-dominant arm. And you can use that for, if you want to use two swords at the same time, which some people did, you can do that as a sort of, parrying blade. That was the same in the West. They did that when they were fencing. You can use that. This sword was a sword samurai always wore when they were inside, when they were indoors, in their own house or in other people's houses. They would leave this at the door. If you were a guest, you would leave this close by if it was your house, and you would have this on you at all times. Because samurai didn't screw with them, so they always were prepared to be attacked. When you're fighting indoors, this is another practice blade, so these are unsharpened because they're made for practice. Imagine you're attacking me, you're coming from that side, and I only have this. I might, try to raise the sword over my head, I hit the ceiling, I hit the wall. When I strike you, I hit the cupboard. A long sword is very practical. The longer the sword, the more distance you can keep from your opponent, but indoors it's just not very good. So that's why they carried the smaller swords. And with these, it's pretty easy to, move around. You can actually move it fairly freely, you're not really hitting anything, so that, that should work. So that's what the samurai would always wear, and, when they went outside, a short sword and a big sword. As you can see, these swords are on display with the sword handle, the tsuka, to the left. That is meant to be friendly. If I were to put it like this, then I would offend my guests, and I would show them, look, I'm prepared to be attacked, because if it's like that, I can grab it and I can unsheath it in one motion. If the grip is actually to the other side, it's much more difficult, because I would have to take it out, I'd have to turn it around, I'd have to draw it, etc. So just a little bit of sword etiquette. The same way, when someone passes you a sword, they would do so with a sharp edge towards themselves, right? Samurai swords only have a sharp edge on one side, to themselves, and yet hold it something like this, so that you can grab it, it's coming at you, you see, it's coming at you like this, so you can grab it the way it should be grabbed, but they would hold on to that bit, so that if you decide to attack them, they still have a hold on the sword. They would maintain sort of alertness at all times. Okay, now imagine a sword would go to, a samurai would go to war. That can happen. You've probably seen the last samurai with the armors and the helmets with the stuff. Well, those armors are actually made of laminated leather. So there's just sort of lamo sheets of leather. And the problem is that leather is actually pretty tough. And when you take a sword like this, you can cut through bamboo. You can cut off someone's arm. You can cut off someone's neck. But with laminated leather, it's a little bit difficult to get through. So these swords would stay at home. They don't provide enough leverage to cut through. These swords definitely don't provide enough leverage, right? I mean, it's just a one-handed blade. So that doesn't really work. So a samurai would carry a sword, usually a tachi. A tachi is a sword like this. Usually it's a bit longer, it has a stronger curvature. It's more ornamental. These swords are worn, no, let's not do it with that sword. These swords are worn with the cutting edge upwards. So if you draw it, you can immediately make a cut because the cutting edge is facing upwards. Apart from that, it's easier to do that because when you have the cutting edge downwards, when you draw the sword, it actually, the cutting edge, this is again an unsharpened sword, would pass through the, they call this the mouth of the koi, like a koi carp. It would actually sort of go down there and may actually ruin your scabbard and dull the blade. With Itachi they did wear it edge downwards. They were more curved, and for some reason that seemed to work. Maybe it was because of practicality. They didn't have that broad sash around their waist, so it would be slung a bit lower and it would be, you know, cutting edge downwards. I don't have Itachi, so I can't show you. So they would have that. They would leave the wakizashi at home. But they would have a tanto. Tanto is just a dagger. This is a pretty big one. Usually they're not as curved. They're a bit, you know, have less curvature, and they are very sharp. Now you can see that this is a huge, I mean, look at the tip. This is extremely sharp, and the tip will penetrate stuff. If you were to make a stab with that, it may pass through the armor of a samurai, but what these things were really meant for was, I'm holding it in such a way that I can't hurt myself, right? I can't accidentally take the scabbard off. This was supposed to be put in the chink of an armor. No matter how good the armor, there's always a chink. And everything on the inside of the body is a good target. So, you cut someone here. They usually had a metal band here and a face mask called mempo. So your face was sort of protected, but even with a metal band, it always ends somewhere. You could jam it under that, you could jam this over it, you could lock someone's arm, jam this into the armpit. If you're very lucky, you may hit the heart, but in any case, there are so many arteries there. Inside of the body, this is a kill, this is a kill, this is a kill, this is a kill, this is definitely a kill. So it's much easier to do that and grapple with one blade, which you can also hold in a reverse position and, you know, just stab or thrust into something. This is not nice, but these things have been perfected over many years to make killing as efficiently as efficient as possible. That's just all there's to it. It's not a fun object. Another nice thing about this is that you can throw them. You can throw a sword, but that's pretty difficult. These blades are much smaller, so you could draw it and, you know, just launch it, then you have a missile weapon. So samurai would often carry 2, 3, sometimes 4 of these when they wore their full armor. Okay, so we've covered the wakizashi, we've covered the katana. This is a katana, this is a katana, this is a katana. They're all just slightly different. This one is very heavy, very thick, and has a very broad blade. It's heavy, so this will cut through. Now the thing about a heavy blade is, once you engage in a motion, it'll probably cut through someone completely because it's so heavy. But the downside is it's very difficult to do really, dynamic stuff with it because it's so heavy. This blade is much lighter. Officially, by the way, I should bow to it because it houses a kami, which is a Shinto concept, something between a spirit and a soul. You have to be careful. Never touch the blade. It's carbon steel, and it will rust because of the salts and the acids in your fingers. This sword is much lighter than the other one, and it has something that I want to show you. It's something called bohi. Right there you see a groove. That groove, we're not really sure why it's there. You call it a blood groove or a fuller in English. One of the theories I like best is that if you make a tsuki, so a tsuki is a stab, then you may actually, the sword will enter someone's body. This is somewhat disgusting, but it may actually draw a vacuum, and you can't pull your sword out. So then you would be sort of pushing against someone, try to pull your sword out. Doesn't really matter. Now, if you have a fuller, that's not really an issue, is it? Because of that groove, there's always air entering the wound. I think it's an interesting explanation. Another interesting explanation is that it has something to do with hasuji. Hasuji is the correct angling of the blade. You can imagine that if you're trying to make a cut, if the blade angling is just slightly off, then the cut will not be as efficient, right? So it has to hit the target straight on. Now, I'm making sure here, just do a short demonstration. One funny thing about the bohi, this groove, is that it will assist you to auscultate, to hear whether you have angled the blade correctly. So if I were to hold it not correctly, you'd get something like that. If I were to angle it correctly, you'd get something like that, which is a completely different sound. So you can actually hear, which is useful for training. Obviously you cannot, when you're having a duel with someone, say, oh, wait, that sound wasn't correct, let me make that strike again. I mean, it doesn't work that way, but you know, when you're learning the sword, it's a convenient thing. Okay. Wakizashi katana, or katana. O is a prefix that means big, large, great. This is a serious sword. You can see it's quite a bit bigger than the average katana. There was a time when it was cool to have as big a sword as you could get, to show how tough you were. Then there were some people, like Miyamoto Musashi, a quite famous samurai, who was known for his dueling prowess, and he was pretty big. I believe he was about 6 feet, which for a Japanese person in the 1600s especially is quite tall. So according to legend, he used an O katana instead of a regular katana. These swords are just really big. They're heavy, they're serious, and you don't mess around with these. But apart from that, it's just like a katana. It's just bigger. Okay, then finally we have something called nagamaki, which means something like big rap. Now you can probably figure out why it's called big rap. I mean, it's rap, right? It's rap, it's not like rap. A big rap, these things are freakishly awesome. This is a very interestingly shaped blade, and it has a huge handle. You remember the naginata I showed you? Right? With a sort of sword on a stick? Well, this is something like that. This is a crossover between a sword and the naginata. Amazing. Amazing weapons. They are difficult to use because they have this huge grip, and just a bit of trivia, if you see a movie where someone holds a samurai sword like this, they had a bad weapons advisor. Your right hand goes all the way near the top, your left hand goes all the way near the bottom. That provides leverage. That makes sure you can make it really hard. You're pushing with this arm, you're pulling with that arm, and that's how you make a cut. If you hold it like this, it just, I don't know, it doesn't work. So watch out for that in bad movies. This weapon is magnificent. I absolutely love it. It's difficult to wield because your arm gets in the way. You may, punch yourself in the stomach with this long handle, but it's great to use. Very big. You can imagine if you stab with this will go through. Look at that tip. Look at how huge, how tapered. This will go through armor. So, I need the scabbard. There we go. One thing you should realize with a samurai sword is that it's not about the size. Size doesn't matter. It just matters in the circumstances. If you're inside, you probably want to use a smaller sword, like a wakizashi, maybe a tanto. If you're outside, you may use a bigger sword. Bigger swords are heavier, more unwieldy, just more difficult to wield, but the greatest sword ever made. I told you about the tachi, right? The tachi is the sword that was, I told you that's what they wear in the armor with the cutting edge downwards. It's more curved and it's a bit longer. Well, then there is something called an odachi. Odachi is, again, the prefix O, meaning great big, and then a tachi, which is big anyway. Then you get something like this. And I'm putting this on the ground here. It really is that tall. It's my size. And I know I'm not the tallest person in the world, but I'm, what, 1 meters 83, something like that. This can only be described as freaking huge. And it's big, it's unwieldy. I'm not going to draw it because it's almost impossible to get it back into the scabbard when you're alone. But what on earth did they use this for? Well, one of the theories is that they used that to strike at the legs of horses. So there would be two guys. You need assistance in drawing it. So someone holds the scabbard, the other pulls out the sword. You know, sort of like this. And then when enemies charge you on horseback, you can wait, and then you can strike at the legs of the horses. And that will break. If not, be cut off, they'll break. Enemy will be, you know, thrown off the horse. And you can fight hand to hand. It's nasty business, but as I said, these things are perfected over centuries to be as efficient as they possibly can be. I don't see anyone using an odachi in a duel. I think that would be kind of weird. They're very heavy, they're very unwieldy. You forget about using them indoors, but, you know. So there you have it. All types of swords. Some of these are more curved than others. This was my first sword. Real sword. Pretty nice. Real sword collectors, when I say real sword collectors, I mean people collecting contemporary swords, like real swords from the samurai era, will frown upon this and say these are not real swords. Real swords are made by smiths and are folded steel, etc. I will not argue with that. That's true. But these are just for fun. I like having these. I like, you know, chopping up the occasional watermelon in the backyard. Everything I've shown you is functional. You can use every single one of them. Apart from this one, I already showed you that in a video. This is a ninja toe, so this is supposed to be a straight sword. I think it's crap. Ninjas didn't really use straight swords. They probably just used curved swords, but whatever, doesn't really matter. It's interesting nonetheless. And that's all there is to it. So you ever make it to this area, you bring a watermelon, and we'll create some watermelon carnage. So I know this video was not for everyone, but I hope it was fun anyway, and I'll see you later. Bye bye.
I have carried this sword for 15 years. We've gone through many battles together, and it has never failed me.